You flipped the propeller with your finger on a Saturday afternoon in 1967 and the engine caught on the third try and screamed to life in your hand, and the whole backyard changed. You were 11 years old. The sound was so loud the dog ran under the porch. The propeller was a blur. The smell of castor oil hit your face like a warm hand. And your father was standing 3 feet behind you smiling because he knew. He knew you had just started something you were never going to forget. That was a Cox .049, and it was the first real machine you ever owned. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. Sears catalog. Every boy in America in the 1960s knew exactly which page of the Sears Christmas catalog had the KX control line airplanes. You did not have to look it up. You knew. Page 347 or wherever it was that year. The P-40 Warhawk, the P-51 Mustang, the Corsair, the Piper Cub, plastic fuselages in olive drab or navy blue with decals and a real engine bolted to the front. A real engine, not a battery, not a wind-up. A 2-stroke internal combustion glow plug engine that burned methanol and castor oil and nitromethane and spun a propeller so fast you could not see the blades. You circled the P-40 with a red pen in October. You showed it to your mother. You put the catalog under your pillow. You dreamed about that plane for 2 months, and on Christmas morning you came downstairs and there it was under the tree in a box with a picture of a boy your age flying it in a field, and you held that box in your hands like it was the most important thing anyone had ever given you. Because it was building it. You have to talk about building it, because the plane did not come ready to fly. You had to build it. You and your father sat at the workbench in the garage on a Saturday afternoon in January, and you opened the box and laid out all the parts. The plastic fuselage halves, the aluminum wing, the landing gear, the control lines, the handle, the little bag of screws, and the engine, the Cox Babe B.049. It fit in the palm of your hand. It weighed almost nothing. It was machined aluminum with a tiny cylinder and a crankshaft and a propeller nut and a glow plug the size of a pencil eraser. Your father held it up to the light and turned it over, and you both looked at it like it was a jewel. Because to an 11-year-old boy in 1967, that engine was a jewel. It was the smallest real engine in the world. It was yours, and you were going to make it fly. Your father showed you how to mount the engine to the firewall. He showed you how to connect the fuel line to the tank. He showed you how the control lines ran from the handle through the fuselage to the elevator on the tail. He showed you how to adjust the needle valve. He showed you how to prime the engine by putting your finger over the intake and flipping the prop backwards 3 times. He did not rush. He did not take over. He let you hold the screwdriver. He let you tighten the bolts. He let you make mistakes, and then he showed you how to fix them. That was the whole point. The plane was not the point. The engine was not the point. The point was your father teaching you how things worked, how a machine went together, how patience mattered, how you did not give up when the screw stripped or the fuel line kinked or the wing did not sit flush. You fixed it. You tried again. And when the plane was done and it sat on the workbench with the propeller catching the light from the garage window, your father looked at you and said, "That looks pretty good." And you carried that sentence with you for the rest of your life. The first start. You carried the plane out to the backyard on a Saturday morning in March. Your father carried the battery. The starting battery was a little box with a wire and a clip that attached to the glow plug to heat it up before you flipped the propeller. You set the plane on the ground. You filled the fuel tank from a small can of glow fuel that smelled sweet and dangerous. You clipped the battery wire to the glow plug. Your father said, go ahead. You put your finger on the propeller. You flipped it, nothing. You flipped it again, nothing. Your father adjusted the needle valve a quarter turn. You flipped it again, and the engine caught. It screamed. It was the loudest thing you had ever heard in your life. The propeller disappeared into a spinning blur. The plane vibrated on the ground like it wanted to go right now. Your heart was pounding. The dog was gone. Your mother came to the kitchen window. The neighbor looked over the fence, and you stood there 11 years old with castor oil mist on your face and the most beautiful sound in the world coming from a machine you had built with your own hands, and your father standing behind you with his arms crossed and a look on his face that said everything a father could ever say without opening his mouth. The first flight, your father held the plane while you backed up to the center of the yard holding the control handle with the lines stretched tight. He said, ready. You said, ready. He let go. The plane rolled forward on the grass and lifted off, and for about 4 seconds, it was the most perfect thing that had ever happened in your entire life. It climbed. It banked left. The engine screamed. The lines hummed. You were flying a plane. You were flying a plane. And then on the 5th second, you pulled the handle too hard and the plane nosed up and stalled and came straight down into the grass nose first, and the propeller snapped and the landing gear bent and the wing cracked at the leading edge, and the engine was still running in the dirt, making a high-pitched whine because nothing could stop a Cox .049. Nothing. Not gravity, not the ground, not an 11-year-old boy who did not know how to fly yet. That engine would run through anything. Your father walked over. He picked up the plane. He looked at the damage. He looked at you. He said, we can fix it. 3 words, we can fix it. And you spent the next week gluing the wing back together and straightening the landing gear and putting on a new propeller. And the following Saturday, you were back in the yard, and this time the plane made it around the circle. 1 full lap, and then 2, and then 3, and you were spinning in the center of the yard, getting dizzy with the lines humming and the engine screaming, and your father watching from the porch with a cup of coffee, and you were flying. You were 11 years old, and you were flying a plane in the backyard, and the world was perfect, and you did not know it yet. The smell. Every man who ever ran a Cox .049 remembers the smell. Castor oil. That is what was in the fuel. Castor oil mixed with methanol and nitromethane. And when the engine ran, the exhaust was a fine mist of burned castor oil that hung in the air and settled on your hands and your face and your shirt. Sweet, warm, mechanical, nothing else in the world smelled like it. Not your father's car, not the lawnmower, not anything. The smell of a Cox .049 running in a backyard on a Saturday afternoon was the smell of boyhood, the smell of learning, the smell of something you built yourself working for the first time. You can smell it right now if you close your eyes. 60 years later, and you can still smell it. Disneyland. If you went to Disneyland between 1957 and 1965, you might have seen the Cox Thimble Drome Flight Circle in Tomorrowland. A 75-foot circular arena with a fence around it where young pilots flew Cox control line planes in front of thousands of people every single day. Shows every 30 minutes from opening until dusk. Up to 10 shows a day. They flew P-40s and Piper Cubs and Curtiss Pushers and did combat and loops and spins and sometimes flew 2 or 3 planes at the same time, and the noise was tremendous and the crowd loved it. Walt Disney himself stopped by to watch multiple times a week, and when Walt was in the audience, the shows ran 10 minutes longer because nobody was going to cut it short with Walt standing there. There was a hobby shop right next to the flight circle selling Cox ready-to-fly planes, and you could buy one and take it home and be the kid in your backyard who could fly. Disneyland closed the flight circle in 1966 to expand Tomorrowland. They replaced it with the People Mover, and the loudest, most exciting thing that had ever happened in Tomorrowland was gone. The Babe B. $3.95. That is what the Cox Babe B .049 cost when it came out in 1956. $3.95. A boy who mowed 2 lawns could buy one. A boy who saved his allowance for 3 weeks could buy one. A boy whose father worked at the factory and whose mother clipped coupons and whose Christmas was going to be small that year could still get a Cox engine for under $4. And it was not a cheap engine. It was a precision-machined aluminum engine that started on the first or second flip and ran reliably every single time. And any piston would fit any cylinder because the tolerances were 25 millionths of an inch. $395. That engine put flying into the hands of every boy in America, regardless of what his father did for a living. That was the genius of Leroy Cox. Not that he built the best engine, he built the engine that every kid could afford. Leroy Cox. You should know who he was. He started in his garage in Santa Ana, California in 1945 making wooden pop guns for children because there was no metal available after the war. When metal came back in 1946 and competitors crushed his pop gun business, he switched to metal tether cars. When a fire burned down his garage, he moved to a bigger shop. When model airplanes started taking off in the early 50s, he spent 8 months with a 3-man crew working 7 days a week developing the Spacebug .049. That engine came out in 1952 and it was so good it destroyed the competition. He sold millions of them. He flew his own Navy on airplane to contests around the country. He ran the Disneyland Flight Circle. He exported to 50 countries, and then his wife died, and his health failed, and in 1969 he sold the company and walked away from the thing he had built in a garage with his own hands. He died in 1981. But the engines he built are still running today. Engines from the 1950s are still being sold as new on eBay in their original packaging because Leroy Cox built something that was meant to last. The hobby shop. You have to talk about the hobby shop. Before there was an internet and before there was Amazon, there was a small store on Main Street or in the strip mall next to the barber shop and the hardware store. The sign outside said hobby shop or sometimes just hobbies. You walked in and the bell on the door rang and the old man behind the counter looked up and nodded. He knew you. He knew your father. He knew every kid in town who flew control line. The walls were covered with Balsa kits in cellophane wrappers. The glass case had engines in it, Fox, Enya, and Cox, a whole row of Cox Babe Bs in their little red and yellow boxes. Behind the counter were bottles of dope and tubes of cement and rolls of tissue covering and fuel cans with warnings on the label. The old man would come around the counter and kneel down next to you and ask what you were flying. When you told him, he would pull the right propeller off the wall and hand it to you and tell you exactly what needle valve setting to use and what fuel mix to run and how to brake in the engine properly. He was not a salesman. He was a teacher. He was the man who kept the hobby alive one kid at a time. And when that store closed in 1989 or 1993 or 2001 or whenever it closed in your town, a piece of every boy who had ever walked through that door closed with it. The day you found your father's engine, you were cleaning out the garage after he passed. You were 53 years old. Your brother was there. Your mother was inside. You were going through shelves of old paint cans and coffee cans full of nails and the boxes of things your father had kept for reasons only he understood. And in the back corner, on the top shelf behind a box of Christmas lights, you found it. A small cardboard box. You opened it, and there it was. His Cox .049. The one he had used to teach you to fly in 1967, maybe the one before that. The one his brother had given him. The aluminum was dark with old castor oil residue. The propeller was still on it. The fuel line was cracked and brittle, but the crankshaft turned freely when you flipped the prop with your finger and you could feel the compression, and you knew in that moment that if you cleaned it up and put fuel in it, this engine would start. 40 years later, your father's engine, still ready, still willing, and you stood in that garage holding it in your palm and you felt him next to you the way you had felt him next to you when you were 11. The way you will always feel him next to you when you hold a machine he touched. You put the engine in your pocket. You did not tell your brother. That engine is yours now. It is the last piece of a Saturday afternoon in 1967 that will never come back, and it would still run if you let it. Then the world changed. Radio control took over in the late 1970s, and control line flying started to fade because radio control planes were more exciting and you did not have to spin in circles until you got dizzy. Video games came. Atari in 1977, Nintendo in 1985. The boys who would have been building balsa wood planes in the garage with their fathers were sitting in front of televisions with controllers in their hands. The liability lawyers got nervous about spinning propellers and flammable fuel in the hands of 10-year-olds. Electric motors came along, and they were cheaper and cleaner and quieter and safer, and they did not smell like anything at all. The hobby shop on Main Street closed. The old man behind the counter who showed you how to start the engine, adjust the needle valve, and pick the right propeller was gone. The company changed hands 5 times after Leroy Cox sold it. Each time it got smaller, and each time the magic faded a little more. In 2009, they stopped making Cox engines altogether. 60 years of production, millions of engines, done. The engine is still in your garage. You know it is. It is in a box on a shelf behind the paint cans, or in a drawer in your father's old workbench, or in a coffee can with some loose propellers and a dried-up fuel line and a glow plug that might still work. You have not touched it in 30 years, maybe 40 years, but it is there. And if you took it down right now, cleaned it up, put fuel in it, clipped a battery to the glow plug, and flipped the propeller, it would probably start on the second or third flip. Because that is what a Cox .049 does. It starts. It runs, it survives crashes and decades and neglect, and the death of the man who gave it to you. It outlasts everything except the memory of the Saturday afternoon you built it with your father in a garage that smelled like sawdust and castor oil with the two of you together. If your father gave you a Cox .049 for Christmas, tell me which plane it was. If you can still smell the castor oil, tell me what year. If you crashed it on the first flight and he said we can fix it, tell me what happened next. And if that engine is still in a box in your garage right now and you are thinking about going out there to check, go ahead, go check. I will be here when you get back. I read every single comment. You walked into the hobby shop and you saw the box behind the glass, and your whole chest tightened because there he was, Frankenstein, painted in colors you had never seen before because the movies were black and white, but this box was green and gray and red, and his arms were reaching out towards you, and the price tag said 98 cents, and you had $1 in your pocket, and that was the day everything changed. Before we go any further, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which monster you built first. The hobby shop was the place where your allowance disappeared in 15 minutes. It smelled the way no store smells anymore, a mix of balsa wood and paint thinner, and the sharp sweetness of Testor's cement leaking from tubes that were never fully closed. And the model kits were stacked on wooden shelves behind the counter or hanging on pegboard walls in cellophane-wrapped boxes. And you walked past the airplane kits and past the car kits and past the ship kits, and you went straight to the monster kits because the monster kits were the only ones that mattered, and the only company that made them was Aurora, and Aurora was about to become the most important word in your vocabulary for the next 5 years of your life. The box was the first thing that got you, not the kit inside, the box. because some artist in New York named James Balsa had painted what was on that box, and what he had painted was Frankenstein in full color, standing in a dungeon with one arm raised and his face stitched together and his skin a deep, unsettling green that you had never seen before, because every time you had watched that monster on television, he was gray. He was always gray. The Universal movies were black and white, and you had never imagined what color his skin actually was. And James Balsa answered that question for you on the front of a 98-cent box, and the answer stayed with you for the rest of your life. You tore the cellophane off before you got home. That sound, the crinkle and rip of tight plastic wrap coming apart in your hands, was the sound of every Aurora monster kit you would ever build, and you heard it so many times across so many months and years that it became a sound as familiar to you as your own front door opening. Inside the cellophane was a box, and inside the box were gray plastic parts connected to runners that Aurora called sprues, and the parts looked nothing whatsoever resembling the painting on the front. They looked like random shapes attached to sticks, and there was a folded instruction sheet with numbered diagrams showing you where each part went, and there was nothing else. No glue, no paint, no brush, just gray plastic and a promise that if you followed the numbers, you would have a monster standing on your desk by the end of the night. The glue was sold separately, and this is important because the glue is the thing you remember most. You remember it more than the monsters. You remember it more than the painting on the box. You remember it more than the hobby shop itself. Testor's cement came in a small metal tube with a yellow label and a red cap, and when you unscrewed that cap, the smell rose out of it and hit you in the face, and it was sweet and sharp and chemical, and it made your eyes water if you held it too close. And it was not really glue at all, it was solvent. It melted the plastic where it touched and fused the pieces together at the molecular level. And you did not know that word when you were 10, but you knew what happened. You watched the plastic soften under the clear liquid, and you pressed the two parts together and held them with your fingers and counted to 30. And when you let go, they were one piece and they would never come apart again. And that was the closest thing to magic you had ever performed with your own hands. You built the first one on the kitchen table, but after that you built them somewhere else. You built them in your bedroom with the door closed. You built them in the basement on a card table your father did not use anymore. You built them at your best friend's house because his parents did not mind the smell. You built them in secret, not because anyone told you to hide, but because the monsters were yours. They belonged to a part of you that you did not share with anyone except the other boys who built them too. There was a name for boys who built Aurora monsters even though nobody ever said it out loud. You were a monster kid. And being a monster kid was a membership in a club that had no meetings and no president and no rules except one. That rule was that you bought Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine at the drugstore and you read it cover to cover. You studied the ads in the back because that was where Aurora told you what was coming next. The ads were not just in Famous Monsters. They were in the back of every comic book you owned, right next to the ads for Sea Monkeys and X-ray specs and the Polaris nuclear submarine. The Aurora ad was always the same, a drawing of a monster with a dotted line around it, and a price that you could afford and an address you could mail a money order to. Sometimes you did mail it, and sometimes you walked into the hobby shop instead because you could not wait 4 to 6 weeks for delivery when the monster was right there behind the glass waiting for you to take it home. You painted them because gray was not acceptable. Frankenstein had to be green. Dracula's cape had to be black with a red lining. The Wolfman had to be brown with gray streaks. The mummy had to be tan with darker wrappings. And the red paint, there was always red somewhere, on the teeth, on the fingertips, on the base where the monster stood. You painted those details with a brush so thin it had maybe 6 hairs on it, and your hand shook because one wrong move would put red on the green and you would have to start over or live with it. Most of the time you lived with it because the Testor's enamel paint was not forgiving. It dried fast and it dried permanent, and whatever you put down in the first stroke was what stayed. You learned more about patience and precision from painting a 98-cent Frankenstein kit than you learned from any class you ever sat through in school. The moment you finished one was the moment you understood why you built it. You held it up at arm's length and turned it slowly in the light. The paint was still tacky in places, and the glue joints were visible if you looked too closely. One arm was slightly crooked because you had not held it long enough while the cement set, but none of that mattered because you had taken a pile of gray plastic shapes on sticks and turned them into a monster. A real monster, standing on a base with his name on it. He was yours and you had made him with your own hands. And there was no feeling in the world that came close to that. Not opening a birthday present, not catching a fly ball, not anything. Because those things were given to you or happened to you, but this thing you had created. Creation is a different kind of joy entirely. And then there was the giant Frankenstein, 19 inches tall, with movable arms and chains you could actually wrap around his wrists, and a level of detail that made the regular kit look like a toy. Of course it was. But the giant did not feel like a toy. The giant felt like a sculpture. It cost $4.95, which was 5 times the price of the regular kit. You saved for it for weeks, or you put it on your Christmas list and circled it 3 times in the Aurora catalog. On Christmas morning, when you saw the shape of that box under the tree, you knew exactly what it was before you tore the first piece of wrapping paper. Your hands were shaking because this was the one. This was the monster that would stand at the center of the shelf and make every other kit look like they were standing in his shadow. The shelf was where they lived. Not a display case, not a cabinet, just the shelf above your desk, or the shelf above your bed, or the top of your dresser. The monsters stood there in a row, and the row grew longer every month. Because once you built Frankenstein, you needed Dracula, and once you had Dracula, you needed the Wolfman, and once you had the Wolfman, you needed the creature from the Black Lagoon, and once you had the creature, you needed the Phantom of the Opera, and the Mummy, and Godzilla, and King Kong. There was one called The Forgotten Prisoner of Castel Mare. That was just a skeleton chained to a castle wall. It was the most haunting thing on the entire shelf because it had no face and no story. It was just bones and chains and silence, and you put it at the end of the row where it could watch the others from the darkness. Every monster on that shelf had a personality that had nothing to do with the movie it came from and everything to do with what you decided it meant. Your Frankenstein was not Boris Karloff's Frankenstein. He was yours, painted the exact shade of green you mixed yourself from 2 bottles of Testor's enamel, and the stitches on his forehead were the ones you painted with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be at age 11. Your Dracula stood with his cape open and his fangs showing, and you had given him eyes that were red instead of the white the instructions suggested, because your Dracula was angrier than the one on the box. Every boy who built the same kit ended up with a different monster, and when your friend came over and looked at your shelf and compared it to his own shelf at home, you both knew that no 2 Frankensteins in America were the same color green because no 2 boys mixed the paint the same way, and that was the whole point. Then Aurora did something that changed the shelf forever. They released the Frightening Lightning series. These were the same monsters molded in plastic that glowed in the dark. You bought Frankenstein again even though you already had him because this one glowed. At night, When your mother turned off the hallway light and your bedroom went dark, the monsters on the shelf began to shine. A pale green light pulsed from inside the plastic. You lay in bed and looked at them, and they looked back at you. The room was completely dark except for the glow of 5 or 6 monsters standing at attention on the shelf above your head. It was the most frightening and the most comforting sight of your entire childhood. The monsters were yours, they were guarding you, and nothing in the dark was worse than what was already on your shelf. There were also monsters you did not expect. Aurora made Dracula's dragster, a hot rod with Dracula at the wheel, a bat on the hood, and a coffin where the trunk should be. They made the Wolfman's wagon, the Mummy's chariot, and Godzilla's go-kart. Every one of them was ridiculous, and every one of them was perfect. When you were 11 years old, a Wolfman driving a custom rod was not a contradiction. It was the logical extension of everything you loved, combined into one box for $1.25. None of this was supposed to happen. A man named Bill Silverstein worked for Aurora in 1961, and he saw a line of children wrapped around a city block in New York, waiting to see a double feature of the original Dracula and Frankenstein films. He walked into a meeting and said we should make model kits of these monsters, and the room said no. Children would have nightmares, parents would complain, retailers would refuse to stock them. He spent months trying to convince them. A psychiatrist made a public statement that the kits would actually help children process fear by giving them something to hold, something to control, something to build with their own hands. Aurora made a prototype Frankenstein and brought it to the Hobby Industry Association show in Chicago, and for 4 days nobody looked at it. On the last day, a distributor brought his 2 sons to the show floor, and the boys ran past every airplane and every car and every ship and grabbed the Frankenstein. The distributor placed an order, and a few more orders followed. Aurora shipped the kits, and a few days later the phone started ringing with the same 6 words from every store in America. Can we have some more monsters? Within 3 years, Aurora went from $2 million in annual revenue to more than $50 million, almost entirely because of the monster kits. They were producing 8,000 kits per day, 3 kits per minute, 24 hours a day. By 1964, they had sold 7.5 million monster model kits at 98 cents each. Every single one of them was assembled by a child sitting alone at a table with a tube of tester's cement, a set of instructions, and a vision of what the finished monster would look like on the shelf, and that child was you. Then the company that made your monsters was sold to people who did not understand them. Nabisco bought Aurora in 1971 because Nabisco wanted to be in the toy business. The first thing that happened under Nabisco was a line called Monster Scenes that included a female figure in a scene many people felt crossed the line. The National Organization for Women protested. Nabisco panicked and the kits were pulled. The executives who had never wanted to make monsters in the first place finally had their excuse to walk away. Aurora was sold again, this time to a British toy conglomerate called Dunby Combex Marx. In 1977, the company went under, and the molds, the original steel molds that had pressed out 7.5 million Frankensteins, Draculas, Wolfmen, creatures, mummies, phantoms, and forgotten prisoners, were scattered. Some were sold to other companies that made inferior copies, some were lost, and some were reportedly dumped. The company that Bill Silverstein had built into a monster empire with a 98-cent Frankenstein was gone. And then the monsters themselves disappeared from your life. You went to college, or you got a job, or you joined the service, and the shelf stayed behind in your old bedroom. One day, your mother cleaned out your room. She looked at the shelf and saw 6 or 7 painted plastic monsters covered in dust. She thought they were junk and she put them in a bag. The bag went to the curb. The garbage truck took them on a Tuesday morning and they were gone. Or you moved and packed them carefully in newspaper in a box marked fragile. And the box did not make it to the new house because your parents thought the wadded up newspaper was trash and threw the whole thing away. Or you took them outside on the 4th of July and set firecrackers next to them because you were 13 and loud noises were more fun than quiet patience, and you did not understand yet that you were letting go of something you would spend the next 50 years trying to get back. One man wrote online that he broke all of his Aurora monsters when he was a teenager, and 30 years later he found out his father had collected the pieces and thrown them away, thinking they were junk. And the man was crushed when he wrote that, and the grief in his words was so raw it could have happened that morning. Every man who built Aurora monsters has a story about how he lost them. And every story ends the same way, with an empty shelf and a memory that refuses to fade no matter how many decades pass. There is a hole on every shelf in every bedroom you have lived in since the day you left home, and you have tried to fill it and you cannot. You cannot buy what Aurora sold. You can buy reproductions from companies that acquired some of the old tooling, and the plastic is similar and the shapes are close, but they are not the same because the box does not have James Bauma's painting on it, and the glue does not come in the same yellow labeled tube, and the hobby shop where you would have bought it does not exist anymore. And the boy who would have built it does not exist anymore either. Not the way he was. Not the 10-year-old with the dollar in his pocket and the tester's cement on his fingers and the shelf above his bed where the monsters stood guard every night in the dark. 7.5 million Aurora monster kits were sold between 1961 and 1977. Every single one of them was assembled by hand. Every single one of them was painted by hand. And today, if you walk into any house in America where a man over 60 lives, you will not find one on a shelf. They are all gone. Every Frankenstein, every Dracula, every Wolfman, every creature and every phantom and every mummy and every forgotten prisoner of Castelmere. 7.5 million monsters built by 7.5 million children, and not one of them survived intact in the place where it was built. But here is what did survive: the smell. Close your eyes right now and think about Testor's cement. And tell me you cannot smell it. Tell me the sweet, sharp sting does not rise in your nose the second you read those two words. Tell me you cannot feel the tube in your hand, the yellow label under your thumb, the red cap between your fingers. Tell me you cannot see the gray plastic on the sprue, the instruction sheet unfolded on the table, the paint bottles lined up in a row, the Frankenstein standing on the shelf with his arms reaching out toward a room that does not exist in a house that has been sold to strangers in a childhood that ended 50 years ago but never really ended at all. Because you are still that boy, you were always that boy, and somewhere in the part of your brain that nothing can erase, the monsters are still glowing in the dark. If you built an Aurora monster, leave a comment and tell me which one was first. They deserve to be remembered, every single one of them. You heard it before you saw it. A high-pitched whine coming from the basement. Then another one, slightly different, chasing the first. You came down the stairs and there they were, two tiny cars screaming around a figure-8 track on the ping-pong table. Your brother hunched over the far end with his controller, your father standing behind him with a coffee cup, and nobody looked up when you walked in because nobody could look away. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. You knew what it was before you opened it because the box was too big for clothes and too heavy for a board game. Aurora model motoring. The picture on the front showed two cars blasting through a banked curve and a kid about your age holding the controller with both hands like he was steering a real machine. You pulled the lid off and the parts spilled across the living room carpet. Gray track sections with metal rails embedded in them, 2 controllers with triggers underneath, a black transformer with a dial on the front, and 2 cars, small enough to sit in your palm, light enough to lift with 2 fingers. But when you held one up to the window and saw the chrome detail on the grille, the tiny steering wheel inside the cockpit, and the word Mustang stamped on the side, you knew this was not a toy. This was something else. This was a machine that just happened to be small. Your father took over. He always took over when the gift required assembly, and you let him, because watching your father build something was its own kind of gift. He spread the track sections across the basement floor and started clicking them together. The sections had these plastic tabs that locked into the next piece. With a snap, you could feel through the concrete. He tried 3 different layouts before your mother came downstairs and told him the turkey was ready. He said 5 more minutes. That was the first lie anyone told. It took him 2 hours. He ran the track around the support column and under the water heater and along the far wall where nobody ever went. When he plugged in the transformer and turned the dial and the little red power light came on, he looked at that track the way he looked at nothing else in his life, like he had built something perfect. The first lap was a disaster. You squeezed the trigger all the way down and the car launched off the track in the first curve and hit the basement wall, and the body popped off the chassis and skidded under the furnace. Your brother laughed so hard he dropped his controller. Your father got down on his hands and knees with a flashlight and fished the car out and snapped the body back on and handed it to you and said, "Easy on the trigger." Those 4 words, easy on the trigger, you spent the next 6 years learning what they meant, because the trigger was everything. Too much and you flew off. Too little and your brother passed you on the inside. The whole art of slot car racing was in that trigger, in the space between too much and not enough, in the tiny movements of your index finger that meant the difference between winning and watching your car tumble across the table while your brother crossed the finish line without looking back. The smell. You have to know about the smell. Every man who ever raced Aurora slot cars remembers it before he remembers anything else. It was ozone, the sharp electric scent of tiny copper brushes spinning against a commutator inside a motor the size of your thumbnail, mixed with the warm sweetness of rubber tires wearing down against plastic track, mixed with something else, something metallic and alive that came from the transformer when it had been running for an hour and the casing was warm to the touch. That smell existed nowhere else on Earth except in a basement with a slot car track running. You could not buy it. You could not fake it. It was the smell of Saturday afternoon with your brother and nobody telling you to stop. 60 years later, if someone put that smell under your nose in a dark room, you would know exactly where you were. You would be 12, you would be in the basement, and someone would be about to lose. Your brother was better than you. That was the fact of it, and you hated it and you could not change it. He was 2 years older and his hands were steadier and he knew the track better because he practiced when you were at school. He had figured out that the inside lane was faster through the curves and the outside lane was faster on the straights, and he switched between them with a rhythm you could not match. He beat you every single race for the first 3 months, every one. And every time he won, he would set his controller down gently and look at you and say, "Good race," and you wanted to throw your car at his head because it was not a good race. It was a beating. And you lay in bed at night thinking about the track and the curves and the trigger and what you were doing wrong. And one night you figured it out. You were braking in the curves. Your brother was not braking. Lift. Not brake. Lift. The next Saturday, you went downstairs and you beat him 3 times in a row, and he did not say good race. He said, "How did you do that?" And you did not tell him. Because some things you earn and some things you keep. The cars, you remember every one. The Thunderjet 500 with the pancake motor that sat upright in the chassis like a coin standing on its edge. The Ford Mustang in dark blue. The Dodge Charger in orange, the Corvette Stingray in red, the Jaguar XKE in British racing green, and the one car that every kid in America wanted and most kids never got. The Batmobile, black with tiny bat fins on the back and a clear plastic cockpit where you could see Batman and Robin sitting in sissy. It was the fastest car Aurora ever made because for some reason the motor in the Batmobile always ran hotter than anything else on the track. If you had the Batmobile, you were the king of the basement. If you did not have the Batmobile, you spent every birthday hoping someone would figure it out. You tuned those cars the way a mechanic tunes an engine. You learned to take the chassis apart by popping the brass gear plate clip and lifting off the top. There it was, the motor. 2 magnets the size of baby teeth. A tiny armature wrapped in copper wire. Brushes that wore down after 100 races. Gears so small you needed tweezers to handle them. Your father showed you how to change the crown gear for a different ratio. He showed you how to bend the pickup shoes so they made better contact with the rails. He showed you how to clean the commutator with a piece of paper. And when you put it all back together and set the car on the track, and it was faster than it had ever been, that feeling was not about winning. It was about understanding. You had opened a machine and you had seen how it worked and you had made it better with your own hands. You were 13 years old and you were an engineer and you did not know the word yet. The track grew. That was the thing about Aurora. You started with a figure 8 and within a year you had a layout that covered the entire ping pong table and part of the floor. You saved your allowance and bought the banked curve sections and the crossover and the chicane and the squeeze track where 2 lanes merged into one and only the fastest car survived. Your father cut a sheet of plywood and painted it green and you mounted the track on top of it and suddenly it looked like a real raceway. You took a marker and drew pit lanes on the plywood. You taped guardrails made of cardboard along the dangerous curves. You built grandstands out of Lego, and you gave the track a name. Every kid named his track. Riverside, Daytona, Thunder Alley. It was not a toy anymore. It was a place. It was somewhere you went. The hobby shop had a wall of Aurora cars behind the counter in plastic cases. You stood there after school with your face against the glass and you looked at cars you could not afford and you memorized their names and their numbers and you calculated how many lawns you would have to mow to buy the Ferrari 512M or the Porsche 917 or the McLaren Can-Am. The old man behind the counter knew every kid who came in. He knew what you raced. He knew what you needed. He would reach behind the glass and pull out a car and set it on the counter and let you hold it. Just hold it, feel the weight, check the wheels, look at the paint, and then he would put it back and you would walk home with your hands in your pockets thinking about that car for the next 2 weeks. Those hobby shops were the cathedrals of childhood. You walked in with nothing and walked out with want. The first car you bought with your own money was different from every car you had been given. Maybe it was a Porsche 917. Maybe it was the Lola Can-Am. You mowed 4 lawns to get it. You walked into the hobby shop with crumpled bills and exact change, counted 3 times on the sidewalk outside. The old man took your money and put the car in a small brown bag and you carried it home like a surgeon carrying an organ. You did not run. You walked. You set it on the kitchen table and opened the bag and lifted the car out and turned it over in the light and looked at the chassis and the wheels and the tiny driver molded into the cockpit. Then you went downstairs and set it on the track and turned on the power and watched it move for the first time. That car was faster than anything you owned. You knew it would be because you had studied the gear ratio on the box in the hobby shop for 3 weeks before you bought it. And when your brother came home and raced against it and lost, you did not say a word. You just picked up your car and blew the dust off the tires and set it back in its spot on the shelf above the track. The spot you had cleared for it before you even owned it. Saturday nights, your father invited the neighbors over. 3 or 4 dads came down to the basement with their sons, and suddenly it was a tournament. Somebody brought a stopwatch. Somebody brought a clipboard. Your mother made popcorn and set it on the workbench next to the oil can and the extra tires, and nobody cared that the popcorn tasted like WD-40. 8 cars on 4 lanes, and the grown men were worse than the kids. They argued about lane assignments. They accused each other of crossing the center line. They protested when a car flew off the track and got a restart. Your father was the worst. He was a calm man 6 days a week. On Saturday night, with a slot car controller in his hand, he was a different human being. He shouted at the track. He banged the table when he lost. He celebrated when he won in a way he never celebrated anything else. And you sat in the corner watching this man you thought you knew do something you had never seen him do. Lose himself completely in a game played with cars the size of his thumb. You brought a friend home from school once who had never seen a slot car track. He walked down the basement stairs and stopped on the 3rd step and did not move. His mouth was open. You had forgotten what it looked like to someone seeing it for the first time because you saw it every day. But through his eyes you saw it again. The table, the track, the curves banked at angles, the cars lined up at the start, the transformer with its glowing red light, the controllers hanging from hooks on the side of the table, the guardrails, the painted pit lane, the name Thunder Alley in black marker above the main straight. He looked at you like you owned a spaceship. You plugged in the transformer and handed him a controller, and he raced for 3 hours and missed dinner, and his mother called your mother, and he came back the next day and the day after that, and within a month, he had his own car and his own lane, and he was part of it. That was the power of a slot car track. It turned strangers into friends and friends into brothers. You did not need to explain it. You just handed someone a controller and the track did the rest. Then the commercial breaks changed. Aurora signed real race car drivers. Jackie Stewart was on the box. Mario Andretti, A.J. Foyt, Richard Petty, and Peter Revson, the handsome Formula One driver who smiled from the cover of every AFX set sold in America in 1973. Peter Revson was killed at a test session in South Africa in March 1974. He was 33 years old. Aurora had already printed thousands of boxes with his face on them. They could not recall them all, so they printed stickers and covered his photograph on every box that was still in the warehouse. You might have gotten one of those sets. You might have peeled back the sticker and found a dead man smiling at you from underneath. Nobody told you who he was. Nobody told you he was gone. You just raced the cars that came in the box and did not know that the man who sold them to you had already left this world. By 1976, Aurora was selling $45 million worth of AFX cars a year. The G-Plus chassis introduced an inline motor that made everything before it feel like a wind-up toy. The cars were so fast that the old tracks could not hold them. You needed the banked curves, you needed the wider rails, you needed magnets pulling the car down to the track at 100 scale miles per hour. The Magna traction system made the cars grip the rails like they were glued to them. For 1 year, maybe 2, Aurora was the most exciting toy company in America. And then the people who owned them decided they wanted more. They expanded into other toys. They spent millions on television advertising. They sold to discount stores at margins so thin, the profit disappeared. When Nabisco, who owned Aurora by then, looked at the numbers, they did what corporations do when they look at numbers. They sold it. Atari, arrived in 1977, and suddenly the television was the toy, the joystick was the controller, and the basement was empty. You could hear it if you went down there on a Saturday afternoon. Silence. The track was still set up. The transformer was still plugged in. The cars were still in their lanes. But nobody was racing. The joystick did not smell like ozone. The screen did not hum at a pitch that changed when you went faster. It did not matter. The boys had moved upstairs and they were not coming back down. November 1977. A British conglomerate called Dunby Combex Marx bought Aurora, and overnight, the company that had taught 2 generations of American boys how to race was gone. The offices in West Hempstead, New York were emptied, desks were cleared, drawers were locked. The engineers who had invented the Thunderjet 500, the Magna Traction, and the G+, the men who had spent their careers making tiny cars go faster, were told to pack their things and go home. Everything was moved to Marx headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. 3 years later, Dunby Combex Marx collapsed under its own debt. Aurora was sold again and again, each time smaller, each time farther from the basement where it belonged. In 1983, what was left of Aurora Plastics Corporation was forced into receivership. A Japanese company named Tomy bought the AFX name in 1984 and started making cars with the same letters on the box, but nothing else the same. The original molds, the original tooling, the original castings that made a Thunderjet 500 feel like a Thunderjet 500 vanished. Some went to Southeast Asia, some went to Canada, some went to Mexico. Nobody knows where all of them ended up. The machines that made the machines that taught you how to race disappeared like cars flying off a track in a curve nobody could handle. The track came down. Maybe you were 16, maybe you were 18. Maybe your mother needed the space for a laundry room, or your father needed the table back for its original purpose. The day it came apart was quieter than the day it went up. You pulled the sections apart one by one. The snap that used to feel like connection now felt like separation. You coiled the controllers and put them in a shoebox. You wrapped the cars in newspaper, each one separately, the way you wrap something you might never see again. The Mustang, the Charger, the Batmobile. You put the box on the top shelf of your closet, and you closed the door and the basement went still. The hum was gone. The ozone was gone. The Saturday nights were gone. Your father went upstairs and watched television and never mentioned it again. Your brother was already at college, and the ping pong table just sat there for the next 30 years, never once used for ping pong. Some of you still have the box. You know exactly where it is, top shelf, back of the closet, or in the garage, behind the paint cans. On the shelf your wife has asked you to clean off 4 times this year. You have not opened it in decades, but you know what is in there. The Mustang with the chipped paint on the right front fender, the controller with the trigger that sticks if you squeeze it too fast, 3 extra tires in a little plastic bag, a section of track with the rail slightly bent from the time your brother's Charger went airborne and landed on the rail and bent it and you straightened it with pliers. But it was never quite right after that. You know all of this. You know it the way you know the layout of a house you grew up in. Every piece, every curve, every scratch that tells a story about a race you lost or a Saturday you won, or a night when the whole neighborhood was in your basement and the transformer was humming and your father was shouting at a car the size of his thumb and your brother was laughing and nobody was looking at a screen and nobody was anywhere else on earth except right there in that room with that sound, with that smell, with those people who are not all in the same room anymore. The company died in 1983. Your brother moved to another state. The hobby shop on Main Street closed. The old man behind the counter who used to let you hold the cars you could not afford, he is gone. The basement was remodeled. The plywood with the painted green surface and the marker pen pit lanes went to the curb with the trash. The track that you named, the one you called Riverside or Daytona or Thunder Alley, exists only in the space between your ears now. There is no photograph. There's no video. There is just you remembering the exact curve where the Mustang always flew off if you did not lift in time. The exact straight where the Batmobile pulled away from everything. The exact spot on the trigger where the motor hummed at the pitch that meant you were going as fast as the car could go without losing it. The cars are worth money now. A Thunderjet 500 Batmobile in its original box sells for $300. A complete 1964 model motoring 4-lane set in good condition goes for $500. A Peter Revson AFX set with the original sticker still over his face sold last year for more than $1,000. People collect these cars the way people collect anything that reminds them of a time when things made sense. But the collectors are not buying cars. They are buying Saturday afternoons. They are buying the sound of a transformer warming up. They are buying the moment their father got down on his hands and knees to fish a car out from under the furnace. They are buying the last Christmas morning that felt like magic. Aurora Plastics Corporation is gone. West Hempstead, New York does not make slot cars anymore. The name AFX lives on a box made by a Japanese company, and the cars inside that box are fine, but they are not the same. And every man who ever held an original Thunderjet in his hand knows the difference the way a man knows the difference between a letter and an email. One was made by someone who cared about how it felt. The other is made by someone who cares about how many they can sell. But the trigger. The trigger is still in your hand if you close your eyes. The slight resistance of the spring, the curve of the plastic under your index finger, the way your whole body leaned into the turns even though leaning did nothing, the way your breath stopped for half a second when your car came out of a curve clean and hit the straight and the motor screamed, and you just knew that your brother was not going to catch you this time. That is still there. That does not go out of business. That does not get sold to a British conglomerate or shipped to Japan. That lives in the same basement where it started, even if the basement is a laundry room now and the track is a shoebox on a shelf and the only thing still running is the memory of a sound you have not heard in 40 years. What was your car? Was it the Mustang, the Charger, the Corvette, the Batmobile? Tell us in the comments. And if you still have the box somewhere, go get it, open it up, hold one of those cars in your hand, see if it still fits the way it used to. I bet it does. I read every single comment. You were 7 years old and you were lying on your stomach on the living room carpet with a box in front of you that was bigger than anything you had ever seen. When you lifted the lid, the entire world came pouring out in a flood of green and tan and brown. 200 plastic soldiers and horses and trees and fences and walls and cannons and a tin fort with painted windows and a gate that actually opened. You dumped it all out right there on the floor and spent the next 4 hours building a world that was more real to you than the one outside your window. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. That box said Marx on the side and it cost your father somewhere between $4 and $7, and inside it was more imagination per square inch than anything any toy company had ever put on a shelf before or has since. The Fort Apache set came with cavalrymen and Native Americans and horses and a blockhouse with a flag and a snap-together stockade wall and trees you could plant anywhere you wanted. Your job was not to play a game that somebody else had invented, but to build an entire frontier from scratch on the carpet between the couch and the television and decide for yourself what happened next. Nobody told you the rules because there were no rules. There was no instruction manual. There was no right way to set it up. You looked at the pieces and you saw a story and you made it real with your hands. If your best friend came over after lunch, he saw a completely different story in the same pieces and you argued about it until dinner, and that argument was the best part. And that was only one set. If you were the kind of boy who lay on his stomach reading about Gettysburg and Shiloh and Antietam in your school library, you saved your allowance for the Battle of the Blue and the Gray, and when that box opened, it was an entirely different war with an entirely different landscape. Union soldiers in blue and Confederate soldiers in gray, a stone wall you could set up anywhere, artillery pieces that actually fired tiny plastic shells across the carpet at your brother's line of infantry, and a mansion with a wraparound porch that you set on fire in your imagination every single time, because that is what 7-year-old boys do with mansions in war zones. Some boys painted their soldiers with Tester's enamel, one at a time, giving each one a face and a rank and a name and a backstory. And when one of those soldiers fell over in the middle of a battle, it meant something because you had made him real. The smell of that new plastic when you first open the lid is something you can still recall if you close your eyes right now. That sweet chemical newness mixed with the cardboard of the box and the warmth of the room and your father's aftershave from when he leaned over your shoulder to look at what you were building. And it was the smell of possibility because everything in that box was waiting for you to decide what it would become. Then there was Battleground with its bunkers and barbed wire and mortar emplacements and the exploding pillbox that blew apart when you hit it just right. You set it up on the dining room table after your mother cleared the dishes and you played until bedtime, and then you begged for 10 more minutes and your father said 5 and you took 15 and nobody stopped you because even he wanted to see how it ended. And Guns of Navarone with the mountain fortress and the enormous cannons and the commandos scaling the cliff face, that was the set that every boy wanted, but not every father could afford because it was the big one, the expensive one. And if you got it, you were the kid on the block whose house everyone came to on Saturday afternoon. And Cape Canaveral with the rocket and the launch pad and the gantry tower and the astronauts made you feel like you were part of the space race, even though you were 8 years old and the farthest you had ever been from home was your grandmother's house in the next county. And the prehistoric times set with the cavemen and the dinosaurs and the palm trees and the volcano had absolutely nothing to do with scientific accuracy and everything to do with the fact that you wanted a Tyrannosaurus Rex standing next to a caveman with a club. Nobody was going to tell you that was historically impossible because it was your carpet and it was your world, and history was whatever you said it was when you were 7. The man who put all of that into a $4 box was Louis Marx. He was born in Brooklyn in 1896 to a family that had almost nothing. His father was a tailor. He finished high school at 15 and got a job as an errand boy at a toy company run by a man named Ferdinand Strauss. Within 4 years, he was managing an entire factory because he understood something that most people in the toy business did not understand, which was that a toy did not need to be expensive to be extraordinary. It needed to be full. It needed to overflow. It needed to make a child open the box and gasp, because there was so much inside that you could not believe someone had put all of it in one place for a price that a working father could afford on a Friday paycheck. Strauss fired him over a disagreement about how to sell more toys for less money. Marx joined the army, served as a sergeant in World War I, came home, and in 1919, he and his brother David started their own company with almost nothing. He went back to Strauss and bought the dies for 2 old toys that Strauss considered worthless. Marx redesigned them slightly, priced them so any family could afford one, and sold 8 million of each within 2 years. He was a millionaire at 26. By 1937, a newspaper in London called him the toy king of the world, and by that point he had 4,000 workers in American factories and 500 more in England. The company was still growing because the depression that was starving every other business in America could not touch a man who sold joy for $1. By 1955, Louis Marx was on the cover of Time magazine. The photograph showed his face bigger than Santa Claus, with toys swirling all around him. Inside the magazine, they called him the Henry Ford of the toy industry because he had figured out how to do for children's imaginations what Ford had done for the American road. His company operated 3 factories in the United States, in Erie, Pennsylvania, Girard, Pennsylvania, and Glendale, West Virginia. The Glendale plant was built inside a former aircraft factory that stretched 1/4 mile long, and it employed more than 2,000 people. They came to work every morning knowing that the things they were making with their hands would end up under Christmas trees in homes they would never see, in towns they would never visit, and that the children who opened those boxes would remember what was inside them for the rest of their lives. He had factories in 8 countries on 4 continents. He outsold Lionel in trains. He sold 100 million yo-yos. He invented Rock M Sock M Robots and the Big Wheel and dozens of other toys that you probably had in your house without ever knowing they all came from the same man in the same office on 5th Avenue. He had started with nothing but a fired employee's grudge, a sergeant's discipline, and an immigrant father's belief that if you worked harder and smarter than everyone else in the room, you could build something that mattered. Louis Marx had 6 rules for what made a good toy: familiarity, surprise, skill, play value, comprehensibility, and sturdiness. But if you asked any child who ever ripped open one of his boxes on Christmas morning, they would have given you a 7th rule that Marx understood better than any toy maker who ever lived. That rule was simple. A toy should make you feel like the most powerful person in the world for the amount of time it takes your mother to call you to dinner. That is what a Marx playset did. For $4 or $5 or $6, it gave you dominion over a world that you built yourself, populated yourself, and governed yourself. The only limit was the edge of the carpet and the reach of your imagination, and both of those felt infinite when you were 7. And here is the thing about Louis Marx that separates him from every other toy company founder you have ever heard of. He married a woman named Renee in 1927, and they had 4 children together, and by every account, she was the center of his world outside the toy business. In 1944, Renee was diagnosed with cancer, and she passed away at 37 years old. Louis Marx, the man who had built an empire on making children happy, fell into a depression so deep that he told people he might quit the business entirely and devote himself to raising his 4 children alone. He did not quit. He came back. He married again 3 years later, and he threw himself into the company with a ferocity that suggested he had decided that if he could not save the person he loved most, he would spend the rest of his life making sure that no child in the country went without the one thing he believed every child deserved: a box full of possibility that cost less than a dinner out. He gave away 1 million toys every single year to children in hospitals and orphanages. He believed that a child without a toy was a child without hope. That was not a slogan printed on a corporate brochure. That was what he actually did with his own hands and his own money every single year for decades. On Halloween night, hundreds of children lined up outside his 25-room mansion in Scarsdale. He stood at the door, personally handing out toys and dollar bills to every single one of them. One year, a busload of college students showed up pretending to be trick-or-treaters. He gave them toys too, because that was the kind of man he was. He was friends with President Eisenhower. The story goes that they met when Eisenhower needed a toy train repaired, and someone said you should call Louis Marx. From that night on, they were friends for life. Eisenhower came to parties at the mansion. Marx visited the White House. They exchanged gifts and letters for years. He never advertised on television because he believed that children should not be manipulated by commercials. He once said that educational toys were given by stuffy ants and hermetically sealed parents who wash their children 1,000 times a day. He believed that a toy should sell itself by being so full of wonder that a child would pick it up and never want to put it down. For 50 years, that is exactly what happened. But Louis Marx made one decision that he could not undo, and it was the decision that ended everything. He never trained a successor. He had learned from watching his old boss, Ferdinand Strauss, get pushed out of his own company that the man at the top should never let anyone get close enough to replace him. So for 50 years, Louis Marx ran his entire empire by telephone from an office on Fifth Avenue in New York. He never visited a factory after 1950, and he never shared his methods or his instincts with anyone who could have carried the company forward after he was gone. By 1972, he was 76 years old, and he was tired. There was no one to hand it to, so he did the only thing he could do. He sold Louis Marx and Company to the Quaker Oats Corporation for $53 million and walked away. What happened next is one of the most painful stories in the history of American business, and every person who ever worked on a Marx assembly line or opened a Marx box on Christmas morning will tell you the same thing. They say that what Quaker Oats did to Marx Toys was not a business decision, it was a betrayal. Quaker Oats was a cereal company. They made oatmeal and granola bars, and they had recently bought Fisher-Price, and they thought they understood toys because they understood breakfast. They did not. The first thing Quaker Oats did was look at the Marx product line and decide that the military toys had to go. The play sets, the soldiers, the forts, the battlegrounds, the cannons, the Green Army men, all of it was discontinued immediately because a cereal company decided that the toys your father bought you for Christmas did not fit their corporate image. After 52 consecutive years of profit under Louis Marx, the company that bore his name took its first loss within months of the new owners walking through the door. They had removed the heart of the company and replaced it with nothing, and the company began to collapse from the inside out in a boardroom that had never heard a child laugh. The factory started closing. Erie was shut down in 1975, and 440 workers lost their jobs in a town that had been making Marx toys since the Depression. A town where fathers and sons and grandfathers had all worked in the same building, making the same toys for the same children year after year, and the assembly line was as much a part of the family as the kitchen table. Girard was closed the same year, and the train factory that had built toy locomotives for 40 years and had outsold Lionel at its peak went silent for the first time since Louis Marx had walked through its doors in 1934. The company that had been the largest toy manufacturer in the world a decade earlier was sold by Quaker Oats in 1976 to a British conglomerate called Dunby Combex for $15 million. Quaker Oats had paid $53 million for the right to destroy a company that had been profitable for half a century and then sold what was left for $15 million, a loss of $38 million. The British owners tried desperately to save it, but it was already too far gone because you cannot remove the heart of a company and expect the body to keep walking. In January of 1980, the last factory standing was Glendale, West Virginia, and they shut that down too. And 800 workers walked out of a building that stretched a quarter of a mile long and had once made more toys than any factory in America. They locked the doors behind them for the last time. Some of those workers had been there for 30 years. Some had started on the assembly line as teenagers and had raised families, paid mortgages, and sent children to college on wages earned by putting plastic soldiers into boxes that would travel to living rooms they would never see. The town of Glendale had been a Marx town for decades, and when the factory closed, the town lost more than jobs. It lost the thing that made it matter. It lost the reason 2,000 people got up every morning and drove to the same building to make something together that brought joy to strangers. And that is a loss that does not show up on a bankruptcy filing. Louis Marx was 85 years old and living in White Plains, New York. On February 5, 1982, he closed his eyes for the last time. On the same day, a bankruptcy court issued the final order to permanently close the Glendale factory and liquidate everything inside it. The man who had spent 60 years filling boxes with imagination for $4 apiece, and the quarter-mile-long factory that had built those boxes for 2,000 families in a small West Virginia town, ended on the exact same day. Whether that was coincidence or something deeper is a question that everyone who ever opened a Marx playset on Christmas morning can answer for themselves. The mansion in Scarsdale was eventually sold to a developer who tore it down and built luxury homes on the grounds. The only thing left is a pair of stone pillars at the entrance to a road that leads to houses where no one knows that the toy king of the world once stood at the front door on Halloween night, handing out dollar bills and smiles to every child who came. The Marx Toy Museum opened in Moundsville, West Virginia, near the old Glendale plant in 2001 to keep the memory alive. But it could not sustain itself and it closed permanently in 2016. Even the museum that remembered him could not survive. But somewhere in your house right now, in a drawer or a closet or a box in the attic or a bin in the basement, there's a small green or tan or gray plastic figure with a rifle or a sword or a flag or a horse. If you pick it up and turn it over, there's a very good chance it says Marx on the bottom, and the weight of it in your hand will bring back a morning that smelled like new plastic and cardboard and your father's coffee, and the sound of a boy dumping 200 pieces on the living room carpet and spending the next 4 hours on his stomach building a world that existed nowhere else in the universe except inside his own imagination. That was the gift Louis Marx gave to every child who ever opened one of his boxes. He gave you more toy for less money, and he gave you more world for less effort, and he gave you a carpet full of possibility for the price of a Friday paycheck. And then a cereal company took it away. If you had a Marx playset, tell us which one. Fort, Apache, Battleground, Blue and Gray, Navarone, the Alamo, Cape Canaveral, the dinosaurs, we want to know. Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. You were going to live on the moon. You believed that with everything you had. You watched the rockets on your family's black and white television, you memorized the astronauts' names, and somewhere between 1966 and 1969, you held a 6-inch rubber man in a white spacesuit, and you knew, the way only a child can know, that the future he represented was coming for you. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. His name was Major Matt Mason, and if you grew up during the space race, he wasn't just a toy, he was a promise. He showed up in 1966, right when America needed him most. The country was divided, Vietnam was tearing families apart. But every evening, between all the bad news, there was this other thing, this incredible, unifying thing happening above the clouds. NASA was sending men into orbit. The whole nation held its breath during every launch. And every boy watching those grainy black and white liftoffs decided the same thing at the same time. I want to go up there. That's where Matt Mason came in. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a superhero. He was an explorer. An astronaut who lived and worked on the moon, and his spacesuit wasn't something a toy designer dreamed up over lunch. It was a near exact replica of a real prototype, the Aerojet Lunar Exploration spacesuit that had appeared on the cover of Life magazine in April 1962. The engineers who designed his equipment weren't toy people, they were former aerospace engineers. One of them was the son of the man who founded Northrop, the company that builds fighter jets. These men had worked on real rockets and real missiles, and now they were building a rubber astronaut for your Christmas stocking, and they built him right. Matt Mason was about 6 inches tall, half the size of G.I. Joe, made of rubber over a wire frame with accordion joints at every bend, knees, hips, shoulders, elbows, so you could pose him any way you wanted. He could crouch, he could reach, he could float. He felt like a real astronaut in miniature, and that mattered more than size ever could. But here's what made him unforgettable. It wasn't just the figure, it was the world that came with him. There was a 3-story space station, a moon base that opened up and had rooms and equipment and a place for everything. There was the space crawler, a battery-powered vehicle that climbed over anything you put in its path. The Unitread space hauler, the space bubble, a jetpack, a satellite launcher, a reconnaissance sled, every single piece designed to look like it had come straight from NASA's drawing board, because most of it actually had. You could spend a whole Christmas morning just opening the boxes, and a whole winter building a world on your bedroom floor that felt as real as anything Cape Canaveral was doing on television. And the crew. Matt Mason had Sergeant Storm in his red suit, Doug Davis, and Jeff Long, a black astronaut added to the team in 1968 at a time when every single real astronaut at NASA was white. A toy company imagined a future more inclusive than the one the government was willing to build. A lot of boys never thought twice about Jeff Long being part of the crew. He just belonged. And that quiet, simple fact might be one of the most beautiful things about the whole line. Then there were the aliens, Captain Laser, the tall, mysterious one, Callisto from Jupiter, with a transparent head so you could see his alien brain, and Scorpio, an insect creature with battery-powered flashing eyes that spooked more than one 3-year-old on Christmas morning. You saved your allowance for the next accessory. You circled things in the Sears catalog months before Christmas and left it open on the kitchen table where your parents would see it. You negotiated, you begged, you were so good for so many weeks that your mother started to wonder what was wrong with you. And when Christmas morning came and you tore the paper off that enormous box and saw the space station, the 3-story moon base with the ladder and the compartments and the little sink, the sound you made wasn't a word. It was something deeper than language. It was pure, unfiltered joy. You brought your Matt Mason to school for show and tell and watched the other kids' eyes go wide. One man described that exact moment being in kindergarten in 1967, watching a classmate bring in his space station for the whole class and feeling a jealousy so deep it stayed with him for 50 years. If you were the kid who had it, you knew. You were the kid everyone wanted to come play at your house. Your bedroom floor was the moon, and everyone wanted a ticket. Because Matt Mason wasn't just a toy you played with. He was a toy you lived inside. You built moon missions on your bedroom carpet. You crawled the space crawler across the backyard dirt and pretended it was lunar dust. You made sound effects with your mouth because the moon had no air. You propped the space station against the wall and imagined it was anchored to the Sea of Tranquility. You spent entire Saturday afternoons on the floor, alone or with your brother, lost so completely in that world that your mother had to call you 3 times before you heard her. Your brother had Sergeant Storm. You had the Major. Together, you were a crew, and there was a detail that every boy who owned one remembers, a detail so small it shouldn't matter, but it does. The way the rubber smelled. That faint chemical scent of plastisol, the same material Mattel used in their Thing Maker. You would hold Matt Mason close to your face to position his arms just right, and you would breathe it in without thinking. 50 years later, that smell is gone, but the memory of it is still there, lodged somewhere between the brain and the heart, in the place where childhood lives. And the beautiful thing, the thing that made it more than just play, was that you believed it was real. Not the toy, the future. You believed that by the time you were old enough, there would be moon stations, there would be space crawlers on the lunar surface, there would be men, maybe you, living and working up there just like Major Matt Mason. A journalist at the Washington Post put it perfectly years later, "Because I was an Apollo baby." The Major represented the idealism of childhood and American can-do-ism. If we put a man on the moon in 1969, surely Major Matt's moon station would be a likelihood within a few years. That was not fantasy. That was the reasonable expectation of every boy watching those rockets climb into the sky. If you grew up in Houston, the space program was in the AIR you breathed. One man wrote that he had the moon crawler, the moon base, and several figures, and that it was the in thing because in his neighborhood, everyone's dad worked at NASA or knew someone who did. But you did not have to live in Houston to feel it. You felt it in Ohio and in Florida and in every small town with a television set. The moon was step one. Mars was next, the future was coming, and it was going to look exactly like the floor of your bedroom. One man put it more bluntly, decades later. The Apollo program lost in space, and toys like Major Matt Mason led me to believe my future would be filled with Pan Am flights to the moon and astronauts on other planets. Instead, I got a future of gas lines, terrorism, climate change, and free internet porn. He was joking, but only halfway. And then on July 20th, 1969, it happened. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. America won the race. The whole world watched. And that was exactly the moment the dream began to die. It's one of the strangest things in toy history. The event that Major Matt Mason had been building toward, the moon landing, was the very thing that destroyed him. Because once America got to the moon, the country simply lost interest. The politicians stopped funding it. NASA scrapped the last two planned moon landings. The public turned to other things. The space race was over, and winning it somehow made it boring. And there was Major Matt Mason still on the shelf, still promising a future on the moon, except now, nobody was going anymore. Then came the final blow. In December 1969, a dock strike made the entire Matt Mason line unavailable for Christmas. The most important selling season of the year, gone. By the time the strike ended, the momentum was gone too. Mattel looked at the numbers, looked at the culture, and quietly pulled the plug. By 1970, Major Matt Mason was done. Canceled at the very height of production, which means the last toys they made are the rarest and most expensive because they barely had time to reach the stores before the whole line disappeared. The wireframe figures had always been fragile. The metal inside would break at the elbows and knees from too much bending, from too much love, really, because the boys who broke their Matt Masons broke them by playing with them every single day. By the time most boys outgrew them, their astronaut had one working arm, or a leg that dangled loose, or a head that tilted at an angle that no real astronaut would survive. You kept playing anyway. A one-armed astronaut was still an astronaut. You found ways to make it work because you weren't ready to let him go. And when the figures broke beyond repair, there were no new ones coming. Your moon base went quiet. The space crawler stopped crawling. The batteries ran out and nobody bought new ones. And one day your mother put it all in a box during spring cleaning. Or it got left behind in a move. Or it ended up at a yard sale for a quarter. And that was the last you ever saw of it. You didn't know it at the time, but you had just said goodbye to something you'd never be able to get back. Not the toy, but the feeling of believing the future belonged to you. Major Matt Mason was never brought back. Not a reissue, not a 50th anniversary set, not a reboot. In all of toy history, he is one of the very few popular lines that simply vanished and stayed vanished. The man who was supposed to lead boys to the moon quietly disappeared from the Earth. Tom Hanks, who starred in Apollo 13 and who produced From the Earth to the Moon for HBO, once called Major Matt Mason his favorite toy as a child. He described him as a great astronaut, a full-on, lifelike astronaut, made with rubber and wire, kind of like Gumby. He was 13 years old when Apollo 11 landed. He was exactly the boy this toy was built for, a kid who watched the rockets on television and believed every word of the promise. He has been trying to make a Major Matt Mason movie for over a decade. It has not happened yet. Maybe it will. Maybe it will not. But the fact that one of the most famous men in Hollywood, a man who has played astronauts and won Academy Awards, still thinks about a rubber astronaut he played with as a boy, tells you everything about what that toy meant, and he is not alone. Men all over the country still think about their Matt Mason. One wrote that he still has his original figure, broken arms and all, sitting in a curio cabinet. Another said he thinks about his space station all the time. Another wrote 6 words that say more than any paragraph could. I wanted it so bad you cannot believe. And then he added, thanks, Dad. 50 years later, thanks, Dad. This was no mere toy. That's what happened to Major Matt Mason. He didn't fail. He wasn't beaten by a competitor. He was a casualty of success, the only toy in history killed by the very achievement it celebrated. The moon landing was America's greatest triumph, and it was Major Matt Mason's death sentence. The boy who played with him on the floor believed the future was coming. The man he became knows it never arrived. We got to the moon, and then we stopped going. But the boy who held that little rubber astronaut and bent his wire arms toward the stars, that boy is still in there somewhere. Still remembering the weight of the space crawler in his hands, still hearing the click of the satellite launcher, still smelling that faint rubber scent of plastisol, still believing, just for a second when he looks up at the night sky, that the moon was close enough to touch. If you ever had a Major Matt Mason, tell us, did you get the space station? Or was it the one thing you never stopped wanting?